matter whether we have anything in this life or don't. Sometimes, and we have so much. I mean, we're so rich, and that's fine. God has blessed us, and that's okay. You can take it. You just have to keep realizing you don't need it. In fact, the more of it you get, the more you know you don't need it, and pretty soon you don't even want it. When people say, I want to give you a gift, they tell me sometimes I say, look, if it isn't combustible or consumable, don't give it to me. If I can't burn it or eat it, I don't want to stick it someplace. Well, there's one other thing. If I can read it, give it to me. Paul says, I have learned to be content. I've learned to be satisfied in whatever circumstances I am. He's not denying that life has difficult circumstances. That's life. He's not denying that he's mistreated, but he is no victim. He has no victim's mentality. He is triumphant. He is satisfied with little. He never forgets what he really deserves, right? And he also never forgets what is coming. Eye hath not seen, ear hath not heard, nor has it entered into the heart of man the things that God has prepared for them that love him, right? So he's trusting in God's providence to meet his needs. He knows the Lord never forsakes him, and he is content and satisfied with little. This sort of Christian humanism that says, I'm the center of the universe and my needs are the driving, compelling force, is certainly an unbiblical approach. I don't want to say, when I say Paul was content, that there aren't some areas where he wasn't content. Let me suggest a couple. He refused to be content with his own spirituality. He was not content with that. He said, "Oh, wretched man that I am." He was not content with his pursuit of holiness. He was not content with his goal of becoming like Christ. He said, "Not as though I have already obtained it or attained it, I press toward the mark." He was not content with the way the world was treating Jesus Christ. He was not content with the blasphemy against him. He was not content with people going to hell and rejecting the gospel. There were a lot of things that he wasn't content with, but they had nothing to do with his physical circumstances. It was enough for him that God had willed those circumstances and that God was showing himself faithful and powerful in those circumstances. He could say with the psalmist, "Whom have I in heaven but thee? And there is none on earth beside thee. My heart and my flesh fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever." To have God was to have everything, and he needed nothing. He had learned that the chief end of man was to glorify God, and the chief joy of man was to love the Lord his God with all his heart, soul, mind, and strength. And listen, the love that he had for God in the relationship was enough. It was enough. It's like that kind of pure, wonderful love that sometimes we even experience when we first fall in love with that life partner, or that love that we cherish with that little child, that it's so pure in itself that it has no regard for circumstances. So we could say that the Christian's life must be a life liberated from need. Liberated from need. Be satisfied with little. Let me take you to a third point. And this one is related to the second one. It's the third element in the fabric of contentment. You need to be independent from circumstances. You need to be independent from circumstances. If you're going to be a person who is satisfied, you must be satisfied with little, and you must be confident that the little is really what God has providentially provided. And thirdly, you must be independent from circumstances. And you see this independence in verse 12. It's a most interesting verse. It's a verse in which he cancels out everything. Watch how he does it. "I know how to get along with humble means. I also know how to live in prosperity. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having abundance and suffering need." In any and every circumstance. That's the key, that little phrase right in the second line. In any and every circumstance. In other words, it doesn't matter. Circumstances are irrelevant. You will learn to be content when you have learned to trust God providentially to care for everything. When you have learned to be satisfied with a minimum. And when you have learned to be indifferent toward your circumstances. I know how, he says. I know how. I know how to get along with humble means. Literally, the verb here has to do with just the basic bare necessities. I also know how to live in perisuo, abundance, overflow in the matter of earthly goods and supplies. I know both of those. I know how to get along with the little, and I know how to get along with a lot. And sometimes that's tougher, isn't it? And keep your perspective. Because in any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret again. I've learned it. I've learned how to be filled and to go hungry, how to have abundance and how to suffer need. And what he's doing is canceling everything out. He's just saying, I'm content. Doesn't matter what the circumstance is. That is real spiritual maturity. He found all his satisfaction in the relationship with the Lord, all his satisfaction in the hope of the future, all his satisfaction in being useful to God for kingdom purposes, all his satisfaction in ministry. He had suffered profoundly. In fact, most of his life falls into the category of humble means going hungry and suffering need rather than living in prosperity, being filled and having abundance. I think that was the exception rather than the rule. But what he is saying is it really doesn't matter. It's not an issue. If I have it, if God provides it, fine. I want to be a steward of it and thank him for it and understand its usage. And if I don't have it, that's fine too. And so, beloved, contentment is an elusive thing in this society because this society wants to make you a victim. This society wants to emphasize and glorify your personal rights. This society wants to personalize and privatize and individualize your spirituality and your Christianity so that it's everything you think it ought to be. This society wants to turn Jesus into the genie you rub the bottle, he jumps out and gives you what you want. This society, through advertising, wants to dissatisfy you with absolutely everything. And I admit there are troubles and issues in life, and there are struggles in life, but so many of them stem from the selfishness that this sinful approach breeds. When you introduce your selfishness into your marriage, it'll mess it up. You introduce it into your family, it'll mess it up. It'll mess up the church. It'll mess up any relationship. It'll mess you up if you're driven by self-satisfaction. That's a terrible thing. That's a tragic thing. And when you tell people that they should receive Jesus because he will produce self-fulfillment and self-satisfaction, you have put them on a road to disaster. Some of them may actually come to know the Lord Jesus Christ and then spend most of their Christian experience wondering why it didn't work out the way you were promised it would. If you're going to be selfish, if you're going to be a victim, if you're going to take every wound personally, if every time somebody says something that offends you or something you didn't like, you're going to strike out, then you will destroy all relationships. You will destroy your own life. But if you will recognize that your circumstances are by the providence of God what he intended.
14, the incarnation of Christ, which is an amazing development, that word would be made flesh, that God would come in human form, that God would honor the principles talked about in Job, man that is born of a woman, that God would humble himself and allow himself to be born of a woman and be made flesh and dwell amongst us, Emmanuel. God tabernacled with us, that God is to dwell amongst us, God. Yeah, he's to dwell amongst us, God. He's not the God who dwells in sanctuaries made by hands or buildings. If God were dwelling in sanctuaries, we'd be in trouble right now. For those that have services that are closed, we'd be in trouble. But God has never intended to dwell in sanctuaries. No, he preferred rather to dwell amongst us. And the dwell amongst us, God, by the book of Acts would be the dwell in us, God. Christ in you, the hope of glory, the Apostle Paul will do. So the God who was afar now dwells amongst us and then ultimately dwells in us. He was afar, then he dwelt amongst us, and now he dwells in us. It's powerful. And he dwells in us without losing any of his omnipotence, omniscience, or omnipresence, that he is both in me and around me. In him I live and move and have my being, so I am in him and he is in me. It's difficult to understand, but follow me. I'm going somewhere with it. I said all of that to point out that we are standing in a perch in a high place on a mountaintop of understanding God. We're standing on a mount of transfiguration. We're standing in chapter 1 on Mount Zion. We're standing in the manifest presence of God, the glorious, powerful God who then dwells amongst us, okay? And from that lofty pinnacle to go to John chapter 2, which is, let me just open it up like it's a scene in a movie. Scene 1, we're seeing his divinity. We're seeing his creatorial power. We're seeing him as Elohim. We're seeing him in all of his divinity and all of his authority and all of his magnificence. And we're seeing him then dwell amongst us and become flesh in us in scene 1. And we're seeing his miraculous power and all that we're talking about in John 1 is just holy and divine. John 2 opens up and he's at a party. And we went from way up here to a scene that is the most human thing imaginable. That Jesus and his disciples were at a party. Now, if he were alive today, we would church him. We would go on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and start writing blogs about him and say, what is Pastor Jesus doing at this party? And everybody's getting drunk and everybody's listening to music and everybody's having a great time. But according to Jewish tradition, you must understand that they did not see everything as worldly as we see as worldly. Jesus was invited to a wedding and he attended with his 12 disciples. So here Jesus is with his 12 disciples and he's at a wedding party. Now, I don't know if they were doing the slide and all the stuff we do now at parties, but we are clear that they are eating and that they are drinking. And we are clear in this story that the governor who was at the feast makes mention of the fact that once people have well drunk, or implying intoxication, that generally at a party like this, they pour out the cheap wine. So we know that this is not just a religious party, and we need not picture the Vatican, and we need not picture some sanctimonious, ritualistic celebrations like what we have as church people today. Jesus was a guest at a party, just one of the people in the crowd with his 12 disciples, and his mother was there, and everybody was there. He wasn't sneaking. He didn't go in the back door. He didn't climb in the window. He was there. But it is just amazing to me to think about the fact that Jesus was there at this party after being in chapter 1 in glory, surrounded by the host of heaven, in the creation, creating the mountains and the seas and the oceans and the wind and the waves. And then enveloping himself in humanity and wrapped up in the cape of flesh, he comes out and dwells amongst us in John 1:14. All of this is divine business, redemptive business, creative business. So he is God in creation. He is Son in redemption. I mean, all of this is kind of language that we see in chapter 1 and chapter 2. He's at a party. He's just a guest at the party, just one in the crowd, hanging out, not losing his sense of normalcy. And that is something that I think is lost on the contemporary church today, some sects of it in particular, more than others. Not all Christian people are like this, but some Christian people have lost their sense of normalcy. In an attempt to be more like Jesus, they have actually become less like Jesus. They think being more like Jesus is to be sanctimonious and to be pious and to be religious and to be set apart and to be as different as possible. But really being like Jesus is to be one amongst them. Jesus was so much like the people of his day in his appearance and in his dress that when the Romans got ready to arrest him, they had to hire Judas to point him out. So there was nothing outwardly that was different about Jesus. There was nothing sanctimonious about Jesus. It was about the Pharisees. The Pharisees were known for their long robes and their long prayers and all of the ritualistic things that they did, but not about Jesus. Jesus just looked like one of the fellas. And he's at a party in chapter 2. And the celebration is going on, and in the midst of the celebration, the Bible begins to tell us that his mother comes to Jesus and says, "Hey, Jesus, we have a problem." He says, "They have no wine." Either they had more guests than they expected, or the guests drank more than they expected, or they were on a budget, or whatever. For whatever reason, they have run out of wine. I doubt that they were totally on a budget, because for this kind of elaborate party, if you study out weddings after the traditions of the Jews in this particular period, a wedding could go on for days. The party could go on for days. And so the wealthy primarily were people who threw long, elaborate parties and could afford to have the guests over. But for some reason, they had no wine. They have run out of wine. And Jesus is kind of exasperated. And John is the only one who lets us listen in on this conversation now. John is the only one. Nobody else lets us listen in on this conversation. Even though we know all the disciples were there, none of them talked about it. Not Matthew, not Mark, not Luke, but John, who perhaps by virtue of his youth is more open to sharing discretionary information. He sees something valuable that happens in an ordinary situation. God often does his best work in ordinary situations. It's not always in pious places with steeples and stained glass windows. It's not always in the midst of orthodox religiosity that God does his best work, but in plain, natural settings with ordinary